we're talking about, is this the end of CentOS, and specifically Linux options for production service providers. So you know us a little bit. Sherwin Crown is a senior member of technical staff. He's got a master's in computer science with a focus in cybersecurity. And he's been active with Linux since around 2001 and using it every day in a lot of big installations and operations to had a lot of experience keeping it running and fixing it. I'm Mark Lindsey. I'm also a senior member of technical staff with Sherwin. I've also studied computer science. My focus was on mobile and real-time networking. And I've been messing around with Linux since about 1991, and then started doing production applications in the mid-90s. The first Linux distributions that I worked with have not been available in decades. So it was kind of a new idea to have a Linux distribution when I got into it. Prior to that, a lot of people sort of did it themselves. So we've been messing around with Linux for a while. So who's ECG? In case you've not worked with us for a while, one way we like to say is that we make the network work. These are some of our clients that we've done different kinds of projects with, a lot of them training and engineering projects. So we'll work on RFI, RFP, helping select software such as this. We're talking about Linux distributions. It's really a software selection. Configure software and do remediation and integration. So connecting things. So a lot of times what we're working with is installing software, integrating with the operating system, troubleshooting operating system issues, integrating the operating system with hardware that's selected. We don't sell any of the hardware or the OS. We do acceptance testing, such as compliance certification once the system is put together, or maybe when upgrades are done, and training and operations, especially in voice and data networks. So whether you're a voice service provider or a data center operator or all of the above, then that's really where we do a lot of our work there. So we'll start off. Sherwin, I'll ask you kind of cover what the big announcement is. What triggered all this activity? You're actually the first one that brought it to my attention a little while back. What's going on?
Yeah, so I think the big announcement here is basically IBM / Red Hat claiming that the CentOS line is basically going to get decommissioned in December of this year. And so they're proposing to repurpose the CentOS line for CentOS Stream, which would now be upstream from the Red Hat enterprise repositories instead of downstream, the way we've been using it before. And so that has major impacts for service providers who wants a stable operating system.
Yeah, so the first slide I had up there was from the Red Hat website. This is from the CentOS website. Well, there's really not much of a difference. A few years ago, Red Hat basically took over CentOS. They took over a controlling interest in the board of directors, so they had a majority on the board, and so they could make decisions like this really without asking anybody else's opinion. So really, there was an era when CentOS was an independent project derived from Red Hat open source code, and then not that long ago, I think I want to say about 4 years ago, that changed, and now really they're kind of indistinguishable in terms of who's in charge. And so CentOS and Red Hat both announced basically the same thing at about the same time. These guys are in sync with one another. They mentioned, I know in the announcement, that CentOS 8, which is kind of the current release that a lot of folks are building, using for new servers, is going to receive updates only through the end of this year. And then CentOS 7 will receive updates through 2024. And we'll talk a little bit more about what updates are. But let's talk about this upstream downstream thing. You mentioned that. I found this clever cartoon diagram from some shipping folks, basically talking about what upstream and downstream are. So this is a metaphor you'll hear a lot in this space. So upstream, like in this case, they've got the lake is shown as being upstream, and then you've got the river, and then you've got the sea. And so upstream side is closer to the water source, it's the mountain, and downstream side is closer to the open waters. And so the metaphor here is about how in this picture, CentOS used to be downstream. So basically, if you think of that river in the middle as being where Red Hat Enterprise Linux did their testing, and they decided what was going to be part of the software, and then CentOS would be downstream of that. So after RHEL finished what they were doing, they would release it kind of into open waters. It's open source, and under the licenses, they had to make it available. Then that stuff became available and folks would get access to that code. And then that's where CentOS was formed. It was by taking that material, that those patches and updates from Red Hat, compiling it and making a new distribution that's binary compatible, bug for bug compatible with their RHEL that was upstream. So it used to be that RHEL was upstream of CentOS, and now it's the other way around in effect. So CentOS is back in the lake, and it's in the sort of the swirling waters of software that's not really tested yet, and then it goes downstream, and then RHEL sort of picks and chooses what they're going to take, and then they do a release of it. Here's another diagram from the Linux cluster. Did a nice image here where you've got another thing going on here. Just mentioned briefly Fedora. And so Fedora has always been kind of a beta. It's had a lot of experimental stuff in it. It's never been intended to be like production quality. CentOS Stream was basically feeding into what they're showing here is 1 million plus projects. So CentOS Stream is really feeding into Red Hat Enterprise Linux and feeding into kind of the different projects that are supporting it. And then you have CentOS Linux coming out of the bottom there. So that's the downstream idea where after Red Hat Enterprise Linux had done all the testing and the release, then you'd have the downstream part. You'd have CentOS coming out of that. And so the CentOS got the benefit of all the software testing and that was done by Red Hat for their own customers. And so if you're a CentOS Linux user, you had all those advantages of fully tested software. Sherwin, have you ever seen anybody talk about problems or kind of concerns they've had with the old model? Was there ever really any concern that came to mind?
You're talking old model of the CentOS?
Yeah, where CentOS Linux was downstream from RHEL.
No, I've never seen anybody actually had any problems. Now, if they're doing something super complicated with the drivers, then maybe that would be a possibility. But for a lot of the customers we're dealing with, that's never been the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you could potentially get yourself in trouble with new hardware that really wasn't supported by Red Hat in the first place. I remember I have heard of some folks talk about their concerns about the community. There was a point at which one of the leaders in the CentOS kind of community structure had kind of disappeared for a while, and then Red Hat basically effectively chased them down and got the rights to everything. So there was a point where like CentOS.org, the domain name was kind of managed by somebody who was not involved in the project at all, and so that became kind of a concern for folks where they didn't have the control that they wanted to. So there was a little bit of community concern there, but the software quality was always great, like you said, because it led people to basically have a really good experience with CentOS. They could really depend on it.
Correct.
So let's talk about updates. So I'll give you this question, Sherwin. So what are the updates and why do they matter?
Yeah, so I mean, the updates that we're referring to here for the operating system are basically bug fixes or software improvements or security corrections, right, for vulnerabilities on the platform and in these different packages. And so it matters in the sense that if you have security vulnerabilities out there, a lot of these servers are easily compromised, and we need a way of fixing that. If you're not updating your server, then you're leaving yourself open to these attack vectors. Also, like I mentioned, if the software is broken with certain bugs, which happens all the time, then you would actually need to patch that as well to actually get a stable platform. So
you're talking about the application like BroadWorks, for example, sitting on top of the OS. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So tell us about CVEs. Can you introduce this idea, what these common vulnerability exposure concept is all about?
Well, yeah. So I mean, these are the vulnerability exposures from the I believe it's from the government, right? The U.S. government.
Yeah, it's managed. So MITRE, this is the website for MITRE. And if you're on the webinar, we're going to send out a link to these slides so you can get it. You can click on all these things and go to these links. But yeah, so MITRE has a contract with CISA, part of the Department of Homeland Security, to maintain this database. That's right.
Yeah, so these are public, a database that's available to the public where you can see all these vulnerabilities for all these different applications out there. And so you can check this out and see if any of your applications that you're running actually has these vulnerabilities and try to address it promptly,
Yeah.
preferably.
So I know Red Hat takes the CVE. So once things are discovered, they take them and then they identify them as errata, and then they publish patches that correct those errata. So some errata are just broken software. They're just software defects. They fix a little bug in the software. And there's sometimes some debate about whether this was a defect or whether this is a new feature that needed to be added. But then other errata are clearly just intended to resolve a security vulnerability, and so they publish that. So that's what this is, the Red Hat CVE database. So they specifically track from the CVE database the CVEs that relate to Linux or any of the software that they bundle with it. So it's, Linux is formally, it's just a kernel, but sort of the package of everything around it includes a lot of software, and a lot of software means there's a lot of defects that are discovered. And so they track that stuff. And then I've got an example here of, I looked at one where this was just updated. So the fix was released a couple of days ago, February 15th. And it is a fix in Subversion Server. So this is a source code management software, code revision control. And it's included with Red Hat. So you install Red Hat or CentOS, then you can get Subversion as part of it. Well, prior to, let's just say last week, you would have this software with a security vulnerability in it, and Red Hat fixed the security vulnerability. Well, the security vulnerability was actually discovered last year in August, and as you can see on the left-hand side, if you look close to that, basically it says, there's a CVE identified, but we're not going to release a lot of details about it. So there was a lot known about it that they didn't make public until the fix was available. So they released the fix. And when they released the fix, they published it. And so folks who have a Red Hat Enterprise subscription, or if you're using CentOS, you would get this fix. This fix would be downloadable and available to you at that point. So you can, with a little bit of looking, you can find how the CVEs get picked up by Red Hat, and then from Red Hat they release a fix, a release date, and so you can see these were released on February 15th. Just to give you an example of a security related issue. This one had a score. They give it a CVSS score of 7.5, so it's on basically a scale of 0 to 10. And so this one is a relatively high severity risk of something that needed to be fixed. So what's the industry response? One of the first ones here is that users are angry. So in a ZDNet article, Stephen Von Nichols said, it's very clear that Red Hat doesn't see CentOS Stream as a production server. As a server for RHEL customers to use to see what the next version of RHEL will bring to them, yes. So he's talking about CentOS Stream, but for a day-to-day work, no. So basically, the perception here is CentOS Stream as kind of a beta release, because Red Hat is not going to be subjecting CentOS Stream to the same level of QA testing to ensure that it's not broken. And he gives a little bit more detail. Red Hat will continue to support CentOS 7 through the remainder of the CentOS 7 lifecycle. So you'll get support through June 30th, 2024. And it's possible they're going to offer an extended support option. So Sherwin, do you think that's fair to say that CentOS Stream is not really intended to be a production server? Do you agree with what Stephen Von Nichols is saying here?
I think that I agree, only because I've also read another article where the CTO of Red Hat, which was Chris Wright, actually stated that it is not a CentOS replacement. So he flat out came out and said that wasn't the case.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if the CTO said it's not CentOS, then I believe it too.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. So this isn't really just the opinion of an analyst. This is really this is really true from Red Hat. So here's another one, a little bit stronger language in a discussion board. This is on Y Combinator called Hacker News. And the view here is, they've betrayed us. So one of the top comments on this said, imagine if you were running a business and deployed CentOS 8, you were expecting to get 10-year lifespan. you're totally screwed now, and Red Hat knows that. And why didn't they make this switch starting with CentOS 9? So let's not sugarcoat this. They've betrayed us. So I'd say a couple of things there. One is he's kind of criticizing the timing, so that he feels like that this might have been done on purpose. I mean, it's really kind of difficult to attribute to malice something that's done on a free release when there's a lot of reasons that you could say, well, this was just kind of a little bit of mismanagement, that, you know, maybe this would have made a lot more sense to announce it with respect to a particular release cycle. I think it probably has more to do with the fact that these 10-year lifespan promises that they were doing on these versions, they were kind of excessive. It's like a free 10-year warranty. And so we're making a commitment. So you had really Red Hat, IBM making a commitment that lasted a long time in the future. And that's a pretty extraordinary promise anyway. And the fact that they went back on it is, it's, you know, surprising. It's kind of unfortunate, but it's not, it's not surprising in every way. You know, I think, do you think, you know, what do you think of this view, Sherwin? Do you think it's, you know, they're fair to say that this is like an intentional effort to betray their user population?
I think folks have an opinion on everything. Let's put it that way. I mean, CentOS had a track record of the 10-year commitment, and so folks planning around that did, you know, take that for granted. I guess is the problem, right? So I believe that, I don't know if they're malicious in doing what they're doing, but I think that they probably had this goal of doing this transition, and so they just ripped the Band-Aid. And so it's unfortunate that CentOS 8 had to take the hit, but for the transition to go through, this is what it is. It was free.
Yeah, I think those are good points. It's it makes you wonder about when you're talking about something that's got a corporate sponsorship and a community element. Yeah. That's where the C in CentOS stood for. Well, sort of, what kind of commitments can such an arrangement really make about the future? Especially when you've got a funding source. There was real money to be spent. The folks who were working on CentOS, I mean, they had they earned real paychecks. They had real rent that they had to pay, and so these are folks. There's real money going on with CentOS, even though the users are not paying. Well, let's do a poll right quick. I'm going to send out, we've got just a poll question we want to send out here. And it's really just 2 questions. And I'm going to post these in Zoom. So you should see it pop up, and you've got access to this. So we'll give you guys a minute here to look at this and just check a couple of boxes. Really, we're just interested in what Linux distributions you're using and kind of which one is your dominant one. So we'll give everyone a minute here to do this, and we'll pick back up here. Okay, we'll just give about 10 more seconds as folks finish up. All right, so thanks for that, and we'll end the poll here. Share the results out. Okay, so which Linux distributions do you use in applications now? So everybody here is using CentOS, no surprise there.
Why they showed up.
Yeah, about half of those who responded are also using RHEL. That's interesting. So a lot of folks with Red Hat Enterprise Linux in their environments are also using CentOS. We've also got Oracle Linux is pretty strong. So Oracle Linux we'll talk about is another downstream version. So similar to CentOS in the sense that it's derived from Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but you can buy support on it, whereas on CentOS you don't have that option. Then we've also got about a quarter Ubuntu and a quarter Debian users, and then some Amazon Linux and SUSE users. Nobody's on Fedora, so we did talk about production applications, so nobody's really um, flying with no parachute there on Fedora. So what's the dominant Linux distribution you're using? So about 3/4 said CentOS was the dominant distribution they're using, but then about 18% said Red Hat Enterprise Linux is really dominant right now. So these are guys who are using a lot of RHEL, but also including some CentOS in there, trying to decide about what to do. And then we've got an Ubuntu organization represented as well. So that's good. Thanks for doing that, Sherwin. What do you think about those results? Is that what you were expecting to see?
Yeah, I think that's what I was expecting to see. I mean, for a lot of the folks that we deal with, we know that CentOS has been pretty popular in their deployment, and for good reason. It was stable, it was free, and it worked really well.
Right.
So, but we also know that there were large production deployments that relied on the what do you call it? The insurance of Red Hat, that insurance policy. So I expected to see some of those as well. Now for the Ubuntu stuff, I can see the off servers that just runs regular applications and stuff, and that being a dominant one there. So yeah, I pretty much expected that outcome.
Let's look at some of the comments that have come in. Grant mentioned, a production server should not be on a rolling release distribution. So a rolling release distribution is, my understanding of it, check me on this, my understanding of it is that they're not only fixing major software defects and security vulnerabilities, but they're also adding substantial new features. They're, updating the versions of some of the core applications in there. Is that a good description, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good description of a rolling release. Yeah, they're definitely adding new features, and some of it may be stable and some of it may not. So I definitely agree with that statement. It should not be on a rolling release.
I think one of the arguments in favor of the rolling release, and I'd be interested to see what Grant says or anybody else has as feedback, is, well, a lot of times the core software team on a package, let's say the Subversion server that we kind of picked on a minute ago I was showing the CVE and the security fix for Subversion. Well, the Subversion guys, they're continuing to make their server better. So once you're on Subversion 4 and then you've got customers on CentOS and they're using Subversion Server 2, well, what interest do they have in going and porting fixes back into software that they've already abandoned? What if those software fixes have already been fixed in the newest version of the Subversion server? So why would we want to have all this activity on old server types? Maybe folks should just move forward. And so the logic would be, well, a rolling release is just a way of saying we're just going to use the latest software. And if that requires us to do some testing and reintegration, then, so be it, but at least we get the advantage of the latest and greatest. The downside, of course, is there's a lot of instability with when you're adding new features and you're moving to the very latest version of software. You're moving to the very latest version of Python and the very latest version of glibc, and all those things that can have pretty substantial implications.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think to reflect on what you're saying there, I mean, the old release, what we got from the older version was stability, and the patch fixes for all the bugs up until that point for that release. When we got to 4.x, that means new features, and new features mean new bugs. And so what we don't know is the unknown of the new bugs from that new feature. Maybe those old ones were fixed, but for every new line of code, there's a possibility of a new bug too. So, it's a give and take situation that we have to pay attention to here.
Yeah. So one of the questions that came in here, and we can touch on this later after we've got a few more slides to go through, but Jessup asked, what are our views on how this will impact Cisco BroadWorks as many systems are built on it? And I'm going to suggest we go through and we'll talk about some of the options that we've got coming up, and then we circle back to this, because Cisco BroadWorks is a really big deal. I mean, a lot of the phone calls made by humans to one another are routing through BroadWorks systems right now. So I think that's a really important question. And they've, just a few years ago, Cisco and BroadSoft prior to them explicitly supported CentOS. In fact, prior to that, they said that they were really using CentOS internally in their lab testing already. And so they had already been using CentOS for a long time prior to that. So let's circle back to Jessup's question on the implications for Cisco BroadWorks. And, on the poll, Johan mentioned that he was using a couple of different things. One was in production servers, he's almost always using CentOS, and the lab machines using a mixture of Ubuntu and Debian. Sherwin, do you see that elsewhere? Is that a common kind of strategy?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do, because if you're dealing with these voice applications, you don't get the Debian option. So, it depends on if you're just launching, a web server here or testing some application, then yeah, it doesn't really matter which direction you go here. But like you're just talking about BroadWorks stuff. I mean, if you're talking about BroadWorks, Debian is not an option. Pick something else. So I guess it depends on the environment.
I think what that would mean also, if you're using lab on one system, say lab on Debian, production on CentOS, then your system management is going to be different between the two. So if your lab includes, for example, your automation around building out a new server, then you're going to probably need some different automation on Debian than you would on CentOS. If you're doing it manually and your server configuration is fairly straightforward, then you wouldn't necessarily notice the difference a lot. Some of the dependencies may vary a little bit, I could imagine, between the two, but if you integrate with those, or if you make your application portable or containerized, then you may be able to mitigate that.
Also, release dates. I mean, the Debian release dates versus the CentOS release dates for applications are going to be different there too. So it
right.
Depends on what you're testing, what versions you're planning on getting and testing on.
Yeah. So let's talk about what options operators have. I know Red Hat Enterprise Linux is free for up to 16 production servers. So this is news. This came out and was announced. You can see the date on this is January 20th. This came out substantially after the initial announcement. And the interesting factor here is that this was never the case before. So you could use RHEL for development workloads, but you were agreeing by license. I mean, you were agreeing by a legally binding contract to not use RHEL for production workloads, even if these are production workloads that have no option of ever making any revenue. So if this is a total nonprofit or this is a total side project, it's just for the good of all mankind, and you're not making any money on it, then you were not allowed to use RHEL for that application if that was really the production server that folks were going to. Now, folks might nitpick exactly what the definition of development was in a case like that, but that was really what they were telling you. This change represents a move where, with an individual subscription account, you can get up to a production use for up to 16 systems. My experience is that they don't have the kinks rolled out with this, but this is their policy, so they'll make it work. I don't have any doubt about that. So it seemed like their subscription management was a little broken, and it's been broken for at least a few days. Probably there's been a lot of interest in this over the past month since they announced it. But how far, Sherwin, would 16 production servers take you? I mean, who and where would that be useful for?
Not too far, I guess. I mean, unless you're a very small service provider that don't have any of the collaborate features, and even then your lab will still have to be something else. So not that far. I think this is definitely for developer purposes. It's not really a production environment. So yeah, I think the number is way too small, and they know that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so this would be probably the really tiny projects. I mean, I can imagine you could run a really micro BroadWorks installation like this. So a BroadWorks installation for, probably for 10,000 subscribers without all the fancy features.
Yeah.
You could fit in 16 virtual machines, and it might be that you have your lab system running on CentOS, or you consider your lab system to be development, so not production. Maybe there may be some way you could get it, but it would have to be pretty small to be able
Definitely
to do
have to
this.
be pretty small. Unless, I mean, you might have to start getting creative and looking at their licensing and see, well, how many accounts can I have here?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you're agreeing
but I'm sure
not
their,
to do
their
that.
licensing is saying not to do that.
Right. Right. But if you and I work together, I'll take all the A side servers, you take the B side servers, maybe we've got an unethical plan that works, right?
I take the lab, you take production. It'll be fine.
Yeah, maybe so. So yeah, but this is an interesting option for some workloads. I can imagine a case where you really don't have that many servers. You maybe you got a data center environment, you got a relatively small number of servers, a few DNS servers, a few different kind of network management servers, and so you have a pretty small organization, and where servers are not really your multiplying like rabbits, and you've got a small number of them, and you could actually get some real work done with this, and that could be pretty powerful. There's also some rules around this about what it means to be a server and how many virtual machines you can make. So I would say if anybody's looking into this, you could look at that and find out, well, for each of these servers, what does it mean to be a physical server versus a virtual machine? Because those rules are a little bit um, subtle. I've noticed looking at these licenses just to see what you're allowed to do and what you're not. But this is new. So prior to last month, you were just not allowed to use RHEL directly for production workloads. So another article from actually it's listed as ZDNet, but it's really Ars Technica here. They came out with a list of some of their Red Hat rebuild related releases. So these are alternatives you might look at if you were on CentOS and you wanted to look at some alternatives. So this is Ars Technica's opinion about it. And so I've got some little encoding here. So CentOS Stream is one option here. So this is free as in puppy. So that's what the little puppy dog means there. And it's got a test tube next to it, which means that this is kind of a beta rolling release. So I think Grant said it well when he commented that this is more effort and more testing on the user's end, basically to approve this rolling release, this kind of beta level. So you've got CentOS Stream, that's one that they listed. Oracle Linux is another one. So that one you can buy support. Now you can get Oracle Linux for free. So I've got a $ next to that, but you can also buy support. And I've got a little picture of a high-rise building there to mean this is supported by a commercial institution. So this is Oracle Linux. And I think you've got some other notes on Oracle Linux. Cloud Linux is another one. You can pay for Cloud Linux. This is a group of cloud hosting providers. It's a little bit vaporware, which is why I have the ghost there, in the sense that they haven't released the version of Cloud Linux that would really be an immediate alternative yet. Springdale Linux is another one. So this is also free as in puppy. You get to take care of it. You get to clean up all the messes yourself. And I've got a little picture of a schoolhouse there because this is actually released by a couple of universities, and it was really focused on high performance computing. So HPC is where let's set up, 1,000 machines just to do a scientific workload. We want to compute the exact location of all of the asteroids between Earth and Mars, or something like that. So high performance computing type applications would be they're really the target for this, but it's a solid Linux distribution. It's derived from CentOS, but of course it's one of those things that can go away at any time. Rocky Linux, it's another vaporware. So this is from the original guy who developed CentOS, and he's announced this project to make another derivative. So basically, this is like CentOS Reborn. It's the same thing. He's going to take the Red Hat Enterprise Linux code, remove all the branding, and then make a new release. And just basically start another community version. So, if you've seen the Rocky movies, they always get up he always wins right at the end after getting, knocked out. That's what makes it fun. So this one, though, is not available yet. So you really can't take this option here. And then there's one from Hewlett Packard Enterprise, HPE, called ClearOS. This is the standard Linux that they put on the ProLiant servers. This one's corporate sponsored. It's free as in puppy. But it also is a bit of a rolling release because they put some things in that are not fully vetted and tested yet. What do you think about their list here, Sherwin?
I think the list is fine. I mean, for real production work, I mean, like we were talking about here with Cloud Linux and Rocky Linux being vaporware, so that's not an option anytime soon. The other ones there too. The Springdale Linux and stuff. I mean, it'll work. I think though, what we need to concentrate on from the service provider point of view is which one the vendors is actually going to support, right? So I think one of the things that I was paying attention to when we were getting ready for this talk is the Oracle Linux platform. And the reason why I was looking into that is because BroadWorks currently supports Oracle Linux already. And so if you were running into some issues, like what would it take for you to migrate from a CentOS 8 server or a CentOS 7 server to an Oracle Linux server? And from what I found, the answer is not that much. So there's a new shift that's happening on the Oracle Linux side as well, where Oracle Linux is trying to take advantage of the disruption of CentOS. And so what they actually came up with was saying that, all right, so we're going to have a free tier 2 of Oracle Linux. You can install it. It's free. It's open source. Um, it, it's the same as CentOS in terms of it's a downstream derivative from Red Hat. And you have the option of either paying for support if you need it or not. So, you know, the interesting thing here is that they actually had, if you go to their Linux orgs, Linux.oracle.com, you can actually see that they actually have a script there in GitHub where you can actually run the script. In a matter of minutes, it would actually convert your CentOS platform to an Oracle Linux platform by basically trusting all GPG keys and downloading and replacing the package, doing audit inventory, and replacing your packages. And then you can choose to whether or not you want to reboot to actually get the unbreakable kernel out of this. If not, you can just keep running as is until you reboot and boot up in the kernel. So you don't even need an Oracle Linux registration account to pull this off. And so I thought that was interesting to put out there. So if you're looking for a CentOS free version, and it's supported by BroadWorks and these other big vendors, then Oracle Linux might be a possibility. Now there are pros and cons to this approach, but just putting that out there.
Yeah, I've heard people say that their concern with Oracle is that they don't like that Oracle, a commercial institution, is taking the output, the sort of the legally required output that Red Hat is generating from Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And taking that and turning that into a commercial project. It's like they're taking something that this company, IBM Red Hat, is required to put out because, of course, Red Hat got the advantage of all the free open source community contributions, and so the GNU public license required them to publish these things. And Oracle's being sort of exploitative, as some of the attitude that I've heard folks
Indeed.
say, that this just doesn't really seem quite fair. Like, if you're going to be paying somebody some money, you should really be paying it to Red Hat, because, like you said, you can buy support from Oracle. I'll say, though, I don't have any experience with the quality of the Oracle support, and I have to admit, I live in the city where Red Hat employees live. One of my friends does support. He works in the storage division. So if you got a Red Hat Enterprise license subscription, and you've got a support option on there, then you can call in if you're having some sort of support problem, and this guy will help you troubleshoot your file system on some crazy new hardware. So they put real hours and real time into doing that. I heard a story of another engineer who had a storage attached storage area network, a SAN, and they had a host bus adapter that it was supported in the Linux kernel. Everything was working fine until it didn't. And so he took the kernel panic info. He had Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscription. They sent it in, and the guys at Red Hat wrote a custom kernel patch to fix the particular defect that they were having. Even though this was software that had not originally been developed by Red Hat, they took ownership of it, issued a patch, gave him a new kernel, and he was back up and running with his production server. And that was one of the advantages. You get a really high skill level capability. I don't know that Oracle offers that same kind of thing where they have developers, hands over keyboard ready to write a kernel patch. And so that would be a question I think worth looking at in this.
I think for me personally, I would only consider Oracle Linux as a possibility if I was looking for a free version. I would not be intending to necessarily pay them money. I would go directly to Red Hat if I was going to pay somebody some money. But if you wanted a minor version release format the way you're having with CentOS, then Oracle Linux will provide that for free as well.
It feels like, Oracle Linux is basically the same as Rocky Linux, except for the Rocky Linux guy, he's doing this for free as a volunteer project until he runs out of time. And the Oracle Linux guys, they're doing this as part of what they're doing because they wanted a good Linux distribution to support their database product was the big thing.
So
that's what
they run their database product and all that stuff on Oracle.
Right.
Linux. So that's what they test these things on.
Right. So a few of the other, non-Red Hat Enterprise Linux-based server distributions. You want to share these with us and what you think?
Yeah, I think that a few of the top ones here are if you go to like DistroWatch and those websites like that to see what are folks using out in the field. It would be like the Ubuntu, Debian, OpenSUSE, and those guys like that. And again, I mean, there's nothing wrong with any of these options. It's just that you need vendor support for whatever application you're going to run on it, right? If your vendor supports it, great. These are great options. There might be some overhead that's involved with learning the new structure. I mean, it's basic Linux under the hood, but in terms of management, there are different tools. But if you can invest that time, then you can make the migration.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the vendor support. I think that's a good thing to think about because I mean, at least to put in perspective, some folks are going to say, well, I don't need vendor support for these Linux applications that I'm running. And that's true. I think there's really two models. One is either you do it yourself or your team and you do it. And so your cost of your organization are borne out of payroll or volunteer time. So if we're not really, let's set aside the volunteer case, but if you're a service provider organization, data center operator, voice network operator, then if you're supporting the application and really they don't care what Linux version it's on, then you're effectively carrying the costs of the integration between the application and the OS through payroll. So your labor costs are where you're doing that. Versus if your vendor will say, well, we stand behind Oracle Linux, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and CentOS, like in the Cisco BroadWorks case, then you're basically paying them to do that integration. And then if you pay somebody like Red Hat or Oracle Linux for support, then you're paying them to do the server support instead of paying an internal employee to do the server support. And so it feels like, and my argument here is in both cases, somebody has to be paid to do the support. Who's gonna, when it comes down to a buggy kernel, who's going to write the patch? Is it going to be you and folks in your team and your organization if you have that skill level? I mean, that's not me. I don't write host bus adapter or kernel patches. But Sherwin probably does, but not me.
I don't think so.
But then, or am I going to outsource that to somebody else? And there's some of that stuff I used to. I mean, I used to literally look at the SCSI code back in the '90s when I worked on these servers. I mean, because it was a little cranky. That was before the days of NAS and SAN. And so there's a lot of labor involved in doing those things, one way or the other. And you're outsourcing that to another company through a software maintenance license, or you're doing it yourself, or you're finding a workaround, some other kind of workaround, which is basically the doing it yourself option. So there's several different layers there where different kinds of work and responsibilities are taken care of. And one of them, like you mentioned, I think is important to think about. Does my application that I'm using specifically support an integration with this version, or does it care? Is it kind of distribution agnostic and I'm just going to do it myself? I think Johan mentioned containers are the way that he's sort of navigating the difference between his production installations and his lab. And so that's, I think, a really interesting option where we're trying to simplify the integration layer between the operating system and the application. And there's probably a lot of win and there's a lot of future for that going forward. So in our last few minutes here, kind of, so what? What are the key considerations about making a change going forward? End of updates is coming. So, after 2024, CentOS 7 won't get security updates. And so that means, a major vulnerability in, let's say, January 2025 will not be patched. And I think there's probably a little fuzziness about the last half of 2024, but officially it only goes through June. So if you're building a new system right now, then 3 years is a really short lifespan. We were looking at the lifespans of some virtual machines when Sherwin and I were talking about this webinar, and it's really not uncommon to see virtual machines last a really long time. And it's a little different now compared to hardware. A lot of companies used to have a hardware replacement policy at 3 to 4 years for a major production server. But now if you've got a virtual machine, you can move it between hardware platforms really easily. And so virtual machines can really last a long time as they're migrated between hardware platforms and the hardware is upgraded underneath the VM. So if you're installing something new in 2021, this is not a long lifespan for a virtual machine. Now, if you can optimize your integration so you can redeploy, let's say you're talking about a BroadWorks system, you can deploy onto BroadWorks and you can just do it again, and you really have very little cost in that deployment time, then maybe you do CentOS 7 now, and then you move to something later. So you sort of kick the can down and you make this decision in a couple of years. Um, that's one option. Another for folks who are thinking about CentOS 8, you really only have updates through this year. And so, which really stinks if you just stood up some servers, you went through all the effort of integrating and testing on CentOS 8, maybe last year, and you were planning to use one of the CentOS 8 releases for a while, and then you're not going to get any software updates after this year. You're going to have to move over to something else. So some end of updates is coming. And I think it's, an important point to reiterate is you can't really live without the security updates. You're going to have to keep security updates, or else your system's going to be vulnerable. There was, one of my favorite stories here is on a couple of viruses, malware that came out a few years ago, NotPetya and WannaCry, and they had major implications for a lot of organizations. They say it was bigger than some of the natural disasters that have hit the United States. Because the number of companies that were temporarily shut down. One of them, was a vaccine manufacturing company. They shut down their vaccine operations because of malware. Imagine if that happened today. If they shut down COVID vaccine manufacturing because of malware. And the reason that the malware was able to penetrate was because they had not been running security updates on their servers. Now, full disclosure, these were Windows servers. But Windows systems, Linux systems are just as complicated as one another. And, some of the releases that have come out of the NSA and CIA show that there's a lot of activity around attempts to exploit Linux platforms as well. So I wouldn't let the Windows Linux difference lull any of us into a false sense of security. I think malware is out there attacking Linux systems actively. And so we need to keep updates alive and running on this. So Sherwin, you mentioned this budgeting point. Tell us about what, if you're planning for the future, you're thinking about implications, how does budgeting come in here?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of my thought process was that if you're choosing not to go with Oracle because, philosophical reasons, like we discussed here, or some other perspective, and we know that there's a strong probability that BroadWorks, Cisco BroadWorks, and these vendors probably won't support CentOS Stream because they really just started support for that. I believe it was like release 20 or something like that, after they were solid. So you need to start considering your options. Are you going to pay Red Hat for support licensing? You know that their minor cost, I think it's like $349 or something like that per year, to pull that off per server, right? So that will add up pretty quickly. Now, again, if in terms of Oracle Linux support, what's interesting here about these guys too, just as an FYI for the panel, is that I think they're charging something like $1,200 per physical server, is what they charge for their licensing. And so what that means is all VMs on that server are covered automatically. And that's a 1-year license. So if you have a beefy server, and you're stacking up, 15 VMs on there, then all 15 servers will be covered under their support contract, for $1,200. Again, can they write the kernels and do all that stuff? I don't know. I've never used them to actually figure that out. That's never been an issue. But their licensing is a lot cheaper than Red Hat in terms of support coverage if you're stacking servers virtually.
Yeah, and I don't personally, I don't really see the ethical difference between using something like Rocky Linux and Oracle Linux. If you're paying Oracle Linux for support, like you mentioned, that's what you're paying them for. You're not paying them for the software, because that's free. You're paying them for it to have somebody that you can open a case with. Now, folks have different opinions on how good the quality of support is, and I know it's going to vary based on exactly who you get assigned and what their skill level is. So there's a kind of some QA questions there that you might have, but that's between you and your sales rep, and as to whether that's a good value on that. But it's probably worth trying if you want to buy the access to somebody who's not Red Hat and who is able to provide you some Linux support, because honestly they do use Linux in a big way within Oracle, and they've been using it for a while. I remember I was doing a project in 2000 and we were right at the point where they were transitioning from Solaris as being their primary platform to Linux as their primary platform. Right at the time I was building a product. And so that was, they've been on Linux. They have a lot of Linux maturity there. within their organization. I think though, it doesn't say it on this slide, but I think the easy and clear option that's just kind of a no-brainer if you're on CentOS is just to use Red Hat Enterprise Linux, just to go ahead and pay them money for the support. Buy the support option. You get everything you knew about CentOS applies on RHEL. So you haven't lost any information by switching over. You can easily migrate from one to the other. You get the same QA that you've been getting today, and actually things are available. Errata bug fixes are available in RHEL a little sooner than they're available in CentOS anyway. And so that's really a sort of the easy, straight option. We're kind of walking around that. We've mentioned that a few times, but I think that's a really direct option for CentOS workloads is just move it over to RHEL. I know Sherwin and our boss, James, has mentioned, he doesn't resent paying money to get support because these guys are doing real work. And, we're software developers too. We like to be paid. Everybody likes to get a paycheck. There's nothing wrong with that. And what Red Hat is doing is legitimately adding value, software development, quality assurance. So a question came in, Jessup asked, with regard to migration scripts from Oracle and CentOS, does Red Hat Enterprise Linux have something similar? Are you aware, Sherwin, of migration scripts to move from between RHEL and Oracle and CentOS, and it sounds like he's thinking about going from Oracle over to CentOS maybe.
Going from Oracle to CentOS or going from Red Hat to
Yeah, and Jessup, you can elaborate on that if you'd like to. But I know there are some migration scripts between the two. Honestly, I don't know exactly which ones are available. All of them look really simple. There's only a few packages that have to be updated, and you basically are changing your repositories out, and you're changing the certificates that.
So you're changing your repositories, the GPG keys. There is a script, Oracle. If you're asking if there is a script to convert from Red Hat to Oracle Linux, yes, Oracle has a script for that as well, from what I've read. Where what they would do for Red Hat is basically to go in, they would basically do an RPM remove of all the Red Hat subscription packages on the box. And then from there, they would do an inventory and start splitting stuff out, same way they did for CentOS. So there's an additional step required for Red Hat, but they do have a script to pull it off.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it sounds like a migration from CentOS to Oracle would be pretty straightforward. I think that one's one of the direct ones.
Yeah.
That's really easy.
I've read about it. I think the problem there with Oracle was that I was trying to look for some research and demonstrations of a Red Hat migration. What they're saying, due to the Red Hat licensing structure, that they were not allowed to demonstrate how to migrate a Red Hat server because it was against the licensing restrictions of Red Hat to pull that off. That's so they funny. Talked about it, but they never actually showed how to pull it off.
So another question.
They're confident it can be done.
Another question is from Chris is on changing from CentOS 6.10 over to Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8. What would you say about that migration?
Disaster recovery and fresh install. That's what I would do.
So not actually changing the operating system, but instead installing a new virtual machine, building a new virtual machine, basically, and Correct. Then moving your application over as if it was a DR.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the CentOS FAQ pages and stuff about their platform, they basically tell you not to do in-place migrations for their platform. They recommend a fresh install with a backup and restore. They flat out say that. So you can try it, but they tell you not to.
Right. Yeah, and that matches my experience that this really not a supported case. I mean, you can make all kind of things happen with heroic levels of effort, and then you still can be pretty unconfident about the results at the end. So there's one other implication here is around migration and retraining. So if you're switching distribution, system management can vary substantially. Package management is one thing. Grant actually mentioned that in the chat. That right. Package management is kind of one of the big things. And I think that's especially true if you're using automation tools to sort of push configurations and management down into a system. Ansible, Puppet, Chef, that family of type of tools. And there's a lot of others that you use to sort of push configurations into the platform. That means you're basically going to need to update your code to work with a new distribution if you're going to change. But if you're going to migrate over, if you're going to go, especially if you're going to leave the Red Hat Enterprise Linux family of descendants, then switching over to a new one is going to mean that you have to know how to do that, and know how to do that same kind of maintenance on the other systems. So another question from Jessup: do you anticipate BroadWorks trying to expand support beyond RHEL to and Oracle to maybe include Ubuntu or Debian in the wake of the CentOS announcement? Is there any kind of news coming out of Cisco related to this? Have you seen anything, Sherwin?
I remember asking at some of the Connect conferences way back when to the the BroadSoft guys and asking like, are you guys going to do this? And they flat out said no. They had no intention to. So I don't see that changing personally. I would be surprised if that happens. So I was curious about that too. I like Ubuntu. It works fine.
Right. Yeah. We as we're wrapping up here, I know we're at the top of our hour, and one other question that came up, like Fedora server is, where would you put Fedora server in this conversation? Is it kind of another rolling release, or is it really something different from the other Fedora that we talked about?
I would put Fedora server as a rolling release. I don't think there's really that much difference between them, honestly.
Yeah, and that's been what I've seen too. I mean, Fedora was supposed to be initially kind of a desktop friendly, user-friendly Linux distro for beginners, like Michael mentioned, and but I think it's over time it's kind of formally kind of gotten put into a box of it's kind of a beta release. It's got lots of whiz-bang new features. There's lots of crazy cool things you can do with Fedora, and there's many ways to crash it, and lots of ways to break your system, and lots of things that you can break it and you get both halves. Once you break it.
And it's not supported by Cisco BroadWorks, so.
Yeah, and BroadWorks is a great example of a case where it's a software company where they really have a strong opinion about what's under the hood. We can think of other companies like, Sensei and Audio Codes and Metaswitch that are all in the voice and video calling platforms, and they're using Linux, but it's under the hood. It's really hidden from the users, and so they basically ship it as an image or as an appliance. And so there's Linux there, but we're not doing the same kind of updates. Ribbon product, the Edgewater server. EdgeView would be another example of that, where there's Linux under the hood, and depending on your software release version of that, you might or might not have visibility into that. Oracle's OCOM is another example where there's Linux under the hood. So a lot of those cases, it's going to be the software vendors that have to make a decision about what to do next. And in many of those cases, they weren't really dependent on RHEL anyway. It was really popular to go with another distribution like Ubuntu or Debian. Depending on the type of application.
Or OpenSUSE.
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's wrap it up here. You feel free to contact us. This is our contact info if you want to reach out and chat about this stuff anymore, anything we said. You guys brought us a lot of great questions, and we really appreciate that. Glad to have you all here on this interesting topic. Hope you guys are able to make some good decisions based on this. Sherwin, thanks for joining us and for sharing your knowledge.
Been fun.
All right. Thanks, guys. Keep in touch.